Due to its unique location, Morocco has been influenced by many cultures throughout the years. For centuries, the country was formed by the mixture of African tribes from the other side of the Sahara Desert, Islamic traditions from Arab neighbors, and European colonizers. All of these influences have created a culture unlike any other, and nowhere is this more clear than in the country's unique architectural style. Today, different design elements can be seen in the buildings throughout Morocco, but the strongest influence in the country's architecture, both in the past and the present, is Islam. Indeed, the specific decoration guidelines of Islam have been used to direct the construction and ornamentation of buildings in Morocco for centuries. In addition to the Islamic influence, Hispano-Moorish architecture, a type of architecture characteristic of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, also took roots in Morocco during the Almoravid dynasty. Today, a combination of these two particular styles can be found in most buildings throughout the country. Understanding the great variety of buildings in Morocco and their diverse architectural styles and elements can become overwhelming. Morocco is often described as a country of allure, mystery and beauty, and this is certainly in part due to its unique architecture. Despite the country's sometimes turbulent history, most of its artistic heritage has survived until today. Design elements of Moroccan architecture also have a strong Islamic influence. These include elaborate geometric patterns, ornamental Islamic calligraphy of Quranic verses, and colorful zelish, a ceramic tile mosaic. Open courtyards with lavish gardens can also be found at the center of most buildings. These were constructed as places of privacy and relaxation. The Hispano-Moorish style also features prominently in Moroccan architecture. Its main design elements include sharp white walls, stucco roofs among the arches, and large domes. The beauty in Moroccan architecture is that these elements can typically be found blended in with Islamic-style buildings such as mosques and madrasas, Quranic schools. What sets Morocco's architecture apart is not only its exceptional blend of different design elements, but also the unique features of each of its traditional buildings. Mosques, riads, souks, ramparts, kasbahs, palaces and madrasas are all different types of buildings found throughout Morocco. They have different purposes and very different architectural designs. Mosques are arguably Morocco's most important structures. In every city, village, or town, no matter how small, you will find at least one mosque with a tall minaret towering over the city. With walls and fountains covered in green and white zelish and a beautifully adorned Marhaba, a niche indicating the direction to Mecca, in stucco and marble, it is no wonder visitors find Moroccan mosques to be the epitome of Moroccan architecture. For some of the most exquisite examples of Moroccan mosques, visit the spiritual city of Fez, particularly Al-Karawiyyan Mosque. Traditional homes and palaces in Morocco are called riads. As private residences, they were built with seclusion in mind. They are focused inward with a courtyard in the center, which allow for both family privacy and protection from Moroccan weather. All rooms open to this courtyard and feature windows only towards this central space. Courtyards are often decorated with a fountain and orange or lemon trees. Depending on the family's wealth, the riad might be decorated with magnificent zelish and stucco work. Many ancient riads have been renovated recently in Marrakech and Essaouira, and plenty have been repurposed today as hotels and restaurants. A type of Medina, The Kasbah is a fortified city built for defensive purposes. Besides their extraordinary size, Kasbahs are quite impressive and were typically built in harmony with their surroundings. The massive outer walls and all the buildings inside easily blend into the background with their tan-colored exterior. The simple construction materials used enabled the interiors to stay warm in winter and cool in summer. More than just schools of religious teachings, madrasas were true thriving centers of the studies of law, philosophy, and astrology. Their architectural design is unique in that it portrays a great disparity, in contrast with the extremely small and simple wooden dorm rooms of the students, stood an incredibly adorned gate and a vast central courtyard lined with magnificently decorated arches with detailed stucco work. The mosque enclosed within the towering school walls would also be exquisitely decorated in sweeping Islamic calligraphy and complex geometrical motifs on shining green and white sellige. It is difficult to grasp the incredible decor contrast in these schools, so make sure you visit Madrasa Bou Imamia in Fez for one of the country's finest examples. Morocco is filled with exquisite architectural gems that tell the intriguing story of a country that has continuously welcomed and absorbed different cultures, lifestyles, and beautiful designs. Moroccan architecture reflects Morocco's diverse geography and long history, marked by successive waves of settlers through both migration and military conquest. This architectural heritage includes ancient Roman sites, historic Islamic architecture, local vernacular architecture, 20th century French colonial architecture, and modern architecture. Much of Morocco's traditional architecture is marked by the style that developed during the Islamic period, from the 7th century onward. This architecture was part of a wider tradition of Moorish or Western Islamic architecture, which characterized both the Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, and Portugal. It blended influences from Amazigh, Berber, culture in North Africa, pre-Islamic Spain, Roman, Byzantine, and Visigothic, and contemporary artistic currents in the Islamic Middle East to elaborate a unique style over centuries with recognizable features such as the horseshoe arch, Riyadh gardens, and elaborate geometric and arabesque motifs in wood, carved stucco, and sellige tilework. Modern architecture in Morocco includes many examples of early 20th century Art Deco and local Neo-Moorish architecture constructed during the French and Spanish colonial occupation of the country between 1912 and 1956, or until 1958 for Spain. In the later 20th century, after Morocco regained its independence, some new buildings continued to pay tribute to traditional Moroccan architecture and motifs, even when designed by foreign architects, as exemplified by the Mausoleum of King Mohammed V, completed in 1971, and the massive Hassan II Mosque in Casablanca, completed in 1993. Modernist architecture is also evident in contemporary constructions, not only for regular everyday structures but also in major prestige projects. Early Islamic period, 8th, 10th century. In the early 8th century, the region became steadily integrated into the emerging Muslim world, beginning with the military incursions of Musa ibn Nusayr and becoming more definitive with the advent of the Idrisid dynasty at the end of that century. The arrival of Islam was extremely significant as it developed a new set of societal norms, although some of them were familiar to Judeo-Christian societies and institutions which therefore shaped, to some extent, the types of buildings being built and the aesthetic or spiritual values that guided their design. The Idrisids founded the city of Fez, which became their capital and the major political and cultural center of early Islamic Morocco. In this early period, Morocco also absorbed waves of immigrants from Tunisia and Al-Andalus, Muslim-ruled Spain and Portugal, who brought in cultural and artistic influences from their home countries. The earliest well-known Islamic-era monuments in Morocco, such as the Al-Qarawiyyin and Andalusian mosques in Fez, were built in the hypostyle form and made early use of the horseshoe or Moorish arch. These reflected early influences from major monuments like the Great Mosque of Kairouan and the Great Mosque of Cordoba. In the 10th century, much of northern Morocco came directly within the sphere of influence of the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, with competition from the Fatimid Caliphate further east. Early contributions to Moroccan architecture from this period include expansions to the Qarawiyyin and Andalusian mosques and the addition of their square-shafted minarets, the oldest surviving mosques in Morocco, which anticipate the standard form of later Moroccan minarets. The collapse of the Cordoban Caliphate in the early 11th century was followed by the significant advance of Christian kingdoms into Muslim Al-Andalus and the rise of major Berber empires in Morocco. The latter included first the Almoravids, 11th–12th centuries, and then the Almohads, 12th–13th centuries, both of whom also took control of remaining Muslim territory in Al-Andalus, creating empires that stretched across large parts of Western and Northern Africa and into Europe. This period is considered one of the most formative stages of Moroccan and Moorish architecture, establishing many of the forms and motifs that were refined in subsequent centuries. These two empires were responsible for establishing a new imperial capital at Marrakech, and the Almohads also began construction of a monumental capital in Rabat. The Almoravids adopted the architectural developments of Al-Andalus, such as the complex interlacing arches of the Great Mosque in Cordoba and of the Aliaferia Palace in Zaragoza, while also introducing new ornamental techniques from the east such as muqarnas, stalactite or honeycomb carvings. The Almohad Qutubiyya and Tinmol mosques are often considered the prototypes of later Moroccan mosques. The monumental minarets, for example the Qutubiyya minaret, the Giralda of Seville, and the Hassan Tower of Rabat, and ornamental gateways, for example Bab Aghneu in Marrakech, and Bab Audaya and Bab Arua in Rabat, of the Almohad period also established the overall decorative schemes that became recurrent in these architectural elements thenceforth. The minaret of the Kasbah Mosque of Marrakech was particularly influential and set a style that was repeated, with minor elaborations, in the following Marinid period. The Almoravids and Almohads also promoted the tradition of establishing garden estates in the countryside of their capital, such as the Manara Garden and the Agdol Gardens on the outskirts of Marrakech. In the late 12th century, the Almohads created a new fortified palace district, the Kasbah of Marrakech, to serve as their royal residence and administrative center. These traditions and policies had earlier precedents in Al-Andalus, such as the creation of Medinat al-Zahra near Cordoba, and was subsequently repeated by future rulers of Morocco. The Berber Marinid dynasty that followed was also important in further refining the artistic legacy established by their predecessors. Based in Fez, They built monuments with increasingly intricate and extensive decoration, particularly in wood and stucco. They were also the first to deploy extensive use of zellige, mosaic tilework in complex geometric patterns. Notably, they were the first to build madrasas, a type of institution which originated in Iran and had spread west. The madrasas of Fez, such as the Bo Inania, Al-Atarine, and Asarij madrasas, as well as the Marinid madrasa of Saleh and the other Bo Inania in Meknes, are considered among the greatest architectural works of this period. While mosque architecture largely followed the Almohad model, one noted change was the progressive increase in the size of the courtyard, which was previously a minor element of the floor plan but which eventually, in the subsequent Saadian period, became as large as the main prayer hall, and sometimes larger. Like the Almohads before them, the Marinids created a separate palace city for themselves, this time outside Fez. Later known as Fez Jadid, this new fortified citadel had a set of double walls for defense, a new grand mosque, a vast royal garden to the north known as El Muzara, residences for government officials, and barracks for military garrisons. Later on, probably in the 15th century, a new Jewish quarter was created on its south side, the first Mela in Morocco, prefiguring the creation of similar districts in other Moroccan cities in later periods. The architectural style under the Marinids was very closely related to that found in the Emirate of Granada, in Spain, under the contemporary Nasrid dynasty. The decoration of the famous Alhambra is thus reminiscent of what was built in Fez at the same time. When Granada was conquered in 1492 by Catholic Spain and the last Muslim realm of Al-Andalus came to an end, many of the remaining Spanish Muslims and Jews fled to Morocco and North Africa, further increasing the Andalusian influence in these regions in subsequent generations. After the Marinids came the Saadian dynasty, which marked a political shift from Berber-led empires to sultanates led by Arab Sharifian dynasties. Artistically and architecturally, however, there was broad continuity, and the Saadians are seen by modern scholars as continuing to refine the existing Moroccan Moorish style, with some considering the Saadian tombs in Marrakech as one of the apogees of the style. Starting with the Saadians, and continuing with the Alaouites, their successors and the reigning monarchy today, Moroccan art and architecture is portrayed by modern, Western, scholars as having remained essentially conservative, meaning that it continued to reproduce the existing style with high fidelity but did not introduce major new innovations. The Saadians, especially under the Sultans Abdallah al-Ghalib and Ahmad al-Mansur, were extensive builders and benefited from great economic resources at the height of their power in the late 16th century. In addition to the Saadian tombs, they also built the Ben Youssef Madrasa and several major mosques in Marrakech, including the Muassine Mosque and the Bab Dukala Mosque. These two mosques are notable for being part of larger multi-purpose charitable complexes, including several other structures like public fountains, hammams, madrasas, and libraries. This marked a shift from the previous patterns of architectural patronage and may have been influenced by the tradition of building such complexes in Mamluk architecture in Egypt and the Culliers of Ottoman architecture. The Saadians also rebuilt the royal palace complex in the Kasbah of Marrakech for themselves, where Ahmad al-Mansur constructed the famous El Badi Palace, built between 1578 and 1593, which was known for its superlative decoration and costly building materials including Italian marble. The Alaouites, starting with Moulay Rashid in the mid-17th century, succeeded the Saadians as rulers of Morocco and continue to be the reigning monarchy of the country to this day. As a result, many of the mosques and palaces standing in Morocco today have been built or restored by the Alaouites at some point or another. Ornate architectural elements from Saadian buildings, most famously from their lavish El Badi Palace in Marrakech, were also stripped and reused in buildings elsewhere during the reign of Moulay Ismail, 1672-1727. Moulay Ismail is also notable for having built a vast imperial palace complex, similar to previous palace citadels but on a grander scale than before, in Meknes, where the remains of his monumental structures can still be seen today. In his time, Tangier was also returned to Moroccan control in 1684, and much of the city's current Moroccan and Islamic architecture dates from his reign or after. The arrival of Islam with Arab conquerors from the East in the early 8th century brought about social changes which also required the introduction of new building types such as mosques. The latter followed more or less the model of other hypostyle mosques which were common across much of the Islamic world at the time. The traditions of Islamic art also introduced certain aesthetic values, most notably a general preference for avoiding figurative images due to a religious taboo on icons or worshipped images. This anachronism in Islamic culture caused artists to explore non-figural art and created a general aesthetic shift toward mathematically based decoration, such as geometric patterns, as well as other relatively abstract motifs like arabesques. While figurative images did continue to appear in Islamic art, by the 14th century these were generally absent in the architecture of the western regions of the Islamic world like Morocco. Aside from the initial changes brought about by the arrival of Islam, Moroccan culture and architecture continued afterwards to adopt certain ideas and imports from the eastern parts of the Islamic world. These include some of the institutions and building types that became characteristic of the historic Muslim world. For example, Bimaristans, historical equivalents of hospitals, first originated further east in Iraq, with the first one being built by Harun al-Rashid between 786 and 809. They spread westward and first appeared in Morocco around the late 12th century when the Almohads founded a Maristan in Marrakech. Madrasas, another important institution, first originated in Iran in the early 11th century under Nizam al-Mulk and were progressively adopted further west. The first madrasa in Morocco, Madrasat as-Safarin, was built in Fez by the Marinids in 1271, and madrasas further proliferated in the 14th century. In terms of decorative motifs, muqarnas, a notable feature of Moroccan architecture introduced in the Almoravid period in the 12th century, also originated at first in Iran before spreading to the west. The culture of Muslim-controlled Al-Andalus, which existed across much of the Iberian Peninsula to the north between 711 and 1492, also had close influence on Moroccan history and architecture in a number of ways, and was in turn influenced by Moroccan cultural and political movements. In addition to the geographic proximity of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, there were many waves of immigration from Al-Andalus to Morocco of both Muslims and Jews. One of the earliest waves were the Arab exiles from Córdoba who came to Fez after a failed rebellion in the early 9th century. This population transfer culminated in the waves of refugees that came after the fall of Granada in 1492, including many former elites and members of the Andalusi educated classes. These immigrants played important roles in Moroccan society. Among other examples, it was the early Arab exiles from Córdoba who gave the Andalusian quarter of Fez its name, and it was Andalusi refugees in the 16th century who rebuilt and expanded the northern city of Tetouan. The period of the Umayyad Emirate and Caliphate in Córdoba, which marked the peak of Muslim power in Al-Andalus, was an especially crucial era which saw the construction of some of the region's most important early Islamic monuments. The Great Mosque of Córdoba is frequently cited by scholars as a major influence on the subsequent architecture of the western regions of the Islamic world due to both its architectural innovations and its symbolic importance as the religious heart of the powerful Cordoban Caliphate. Many of its features, such as the ornamental ribbed domes, the minbar, and the polygonal mihrab chamber, would go on to be recurring models of later elements in the Islamic architecture of the wider region. For much of the 10th century, the Caliphate of Córdoba held northern Morocco in its sphere of influence. During this period, Caliph Obed or-Rahman III contributed to the architecture of Fez by sponsoring the expansion of the Chefchaouen Mosque. The same caliph also oversaw the construction of the first minaret of Córdoba's mosque, whose shape, a square-based shaft with a secondary lantern tower above it, some scholars see as precursor to other minarets in Al-Andalus and Morocco. Around the same time, in 756, he also sponsored the construction of a similar, though simpler, minaret for the Chefchaouen Mosque, while the Umayyad governor of Fez sponsored the construction of a similar minaret for the Al-Andalusian Mosque across the river. Starting in the 11th century, the Berber-led Almoravid and Almohad empires, which were based in Morocco but also controlled Al-Andalus, were instrumental in combining the artistic trends of both North Africa and Al-Andalus, leading to what eventually became the definitive Hispano-Moorish or Andalusi Maghribi style of the region. The famous Almoravid minbar in Marrakech, commissioned from a workshop of craftsmen in Córdoba, is one of the examples illustrating this cross-continental sharing of art and forms. These traditions of Moorish art and architecture were continued in Morocco and the wider Maghreb well after the end of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. A very prominent and distinctive element of Moroccan and Moorish architecture is its heavy use of carved stucco for decoration across walls and ceilings. Stucco, which is relatively cheap and easily sculpted, was carved and painted with motifs from a large repertoire including floral and vegetal motifs, arabesques, geometric patterns, calligraphic compositions, and muqarnas forms. These were also common features in sculpted wood decoration. Tilework, particularly in the form of mosaic tilework called zellige, was a standard decorative element along lower walls and for the paving of floors. It consisted of hand-cut pieces of faience in different colors fitted together to form elaborate geometric motifs, often based on radiating star patterns. Zellige made its appearance in the region during the 10th century and became widespread by the 14th century during the Marinid period. It may have been inspired or derived from Byzantine mosaics and then adapted by Muslim craftsmen for faience tiles. The tiles are first fabricated in glazed squares, typically 10 centimeters per side, then cut by hand into a variety of pre-established shapes, usually memorized by heart, necessary to form the overall pattern. This pre-established repertoire of shapes combined to generate a variety of complex patterns is also known as the Hasbar method. Although the exact patterns vary from case to case, the underlying principles have been constant for centuries, and Moroccan craftsmen are still adept at making them today. Metal, particularly bronze and copper, was also used to decorate or protect certain elements. Notably, the doors of many medieval mosques and madrasas were covered with bronze or copper plating, which was carved and chiseled with geometric, arabesque, and calligraphic motifs. The oldest surviving bronze artworks in Moorish Moroccan art, for example, are the 12th century bronze fittings found on several doors of the Karourian Mosque in Fez. Perhaps the most characteristic archetype of Moroccan and Western Islamic architecture generally is the so-called Moorish or horseshoe arch. This is an arch where the curves of the arch continue downward past the horizontal middle axis of the circle and begin to curve towards each other, rather than just being semicircular, forming half a circle only. This arch profile became nearly ubiquitous in the region from the very beginning of the Islamic period. The origin of this arch appears to date back to the preceding Byzantine period across the Mediterranean, as versions of it appear in Byzantine-era buildings in Cappadocia, Armenia, and Syria. They also appear frequently in Visigothic churches in the Iberian Peninsula, 5th–7th centuries. Perhaps due to this Visigothic influence, horseshoe arches were particularly predominant afterwards in Al-Andalus under the Umayyads of Cordoba, although the Andalusi arch was of slightly different profile than the Visigothic arch. Arches were not only used for supporting the weight of the structure above them. Lined arches and arched niches were also used as decorative elements. The mihrab, niche symbolizing the qibla, of a mosque was almost invariably in the shape of horseshoe arch. Starting in the Almoravid period, the first pointed or broken horseshoe arches began to appear in the region and became more widespread during the Almohad period. This arch is likely of North African origin, since pointed arches were already present in earlier Fatimid architecture further east. Polylobe, or multifoil, arches have their earliest precedents in Fatimid architecture in Ifriqiya and Egypt, and had also appeared in Andalusi architecture such as the Aliaferia Palace. In the Almoravid and Almohad periods, this type of arch was further refined for decorative functions, while horseshoe arches continued to be standard elsewhere. It appears in the Great Mosque of Tlemcen, in Algeria, and the Mosque of Tinmol, in Morocco. Arabesques, or floral and vegetal motifs, derive from a long tradition of similar motifs in Syrian, Hellenistic, and Roman architectural ornamentation. Early arabesque motifs in Umayyad Cordoba, such as those seen at the Great Mosque or Medinat al-Zahra, continued to make use of acanthus leaves and grapevine motifs from this Hellenistic tradition. Almoravid and Almohad architecture made more use of a general striated leaf motif, often curling and splitting into unequal parts along an axis of symmetry. Palmettes and, to a lesser extent, seashell and pine cone images are also featured. In the late 16th century, Saadian architecture sometimes made use of a mandorla type, or almond-shaped, motif which may have been of Ottoman influence. Various types of interlacing lozenge-like motifs are heavily featured on the surface of minarets starting in the Almohad period, 12th–13th centuries, and are later found in other decorations such as carved stucco along walls in Marinid and Saadian architecture, eventually becoming a standard feature in the Moroccan ornamental repertoire in combination with arabesques. This motif, typically called sukkah, meaning net, is believed by some scholars to have originated with the large interlacing arches in the 10th century extension of the Great Mosque of Córdoba by Caliph al-Hakam II. It was then miniaturized and widened into a repeating net-like pattern that can cover surfaces. This motif, in turn, had many detailed variations. One common version, called Dari Waqtaf, step and shoulder, by Moroccan craftsmen, makes use of alternating straight and curved lines which cross each other on their symmetrical axes, forming a motif that looks roughly like a fleur-de-lis or palmette shape. Another version, also commonly found on minarets in alternation with the Dari Waqtaf, consists of interlacing multifoil/polylobed arches which form a repeating partial trefoil shape. Geometric patterns, most typically making use of intersecting straight lines which are rotated to form a radiating star-like pattern, were common in Islamic architecture generally and across Moroccan architecture. These are found in carved stucco and wood decoration, and most notably in Zellige mosaic tilework. Other polygon motifs are also found, often in combination with arabesques. Many Islamic monuments feature inscriptions of one kind or another which serve to either decorate or inform, or both. Arabic calligraphy, as in other parts of the Muslim world, was also an art form. Many buildings had foundation inscriptions which record the date of their construction and the patron who sponsored it. Inscriptions could also feature Quranic verses, exhortations of God, and other religiously significant passages. Early inscriptions were generally written in the Kufic script, a style where letters were written with straight lines and had fewer flourishes. At a slightly later period, mainly in the 11th century, Kufic letters were enhanced with ornamentation, particularly to fill the empty spaces that were usually present above the letters. This resulted in the addition of floral forms or arabesque backgrounds to calligraphic compositions. In the 12th century, a more cursive script began to appear, though it only became commonplace in monuments from the Marinid period, 13th–14th century, onward. Kufic was still employed, especially for more formal or solemn inscriptions such as religious content. By contrast, Kufic script was also used in a more strictly decorative form, as the starting point for an interlacing motif that could be woven into a larger arabesque background. Mosque architecture in Morocco was heavily influenced from the beginning by major well-known mosques in Tunisia and Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain and Portugal, two countries from which many Arab and Muslim immigrants to Morocco originated. The Great Mosque of Chefchaouen and the Great Mosque of Córdoba, in particular, were models of mosque architecture. Accordingly, most mosques in Morocco have roughly rectangular floor plans and follow the hypostyle format. They consist of a large prayer hall upheld and divided by rows of horseshoe arches running either parallel or perpendicular to the Qibla wall, the wall towards which prayers faced. The Qibla, direction of prayer, was always symbolized by a decorative niche or alcove in the Qibla wall, known as a mihrab. Next to the mihrab there was usually a symbolic pulpit known as a minbar. The mosque also normally included, close to entrance, a san, courtyard, which often had fountains or water basins to assist with ablutions. In early periods this courtyard was relatively minor in proportion to the rest of the mosque, but in later periods it became progressively larger until it was equal in size to the prayer hall and sometimes larger. Lastly, mosque buildings were distinguished by their minarets, towers from which the muezzin issues the call to prayer to the surrounding city. This was historically done by the muezzin climbing to the top and projecting his voice over the rooftops, but nowadays the call is issued over modern megaphones installed on the tower. Moroccan minarets traditionally have a square shaft and are arranged in two tiers: the main shaft, which makes up most of its height, and a much smaller secondary tower above this, which is in turn topped by a finial of copper or brass spheres. Some Moroccan minarets have octagonal shafts, though this is more characteristic of the northern parts of the country. Inside the main shaft a staircase, and in other cases a ramp, ascends to the top of the minaret. Medieval Moroccan mosques also frequently followed the T-type model established in the Almohad period. In this model, the aisle or nave between the arches running towards the mihrab and perpendicular to the Qibla wall was wider than the others, as was also the aisle directly in front of and along the Qibla wall, running parallel to the Qibla wall, thus forming a T-shaped space in the floor plan of the mosque, which was often accentuated by greater decoration. For example, more elaborate arch shapes around it or decorative cupola ceilings at each end of the T. The madrasa was an institution which originated in northeastern Iran by the early 11th century and was progressively adopted further west. These establishments provided higher education and served to train Islamic scholars, particularly in Islamic law and jurisprudence, fiqh. The madrasa in the Sunni world was generally antithetical to more heterodox religious doctrines, including the doctrine espoused by the Almohad dynasty. As such, it only came to flourish in Morocco in the late 13th century, under the Marinid dynasty, which succeeded the Almohads. To the Marinids, madrasas also played a part in bolstering the political legitimacy of their dynasty. They used this patronage to encourage the loyalty of the country's influential but independent religious elites and also to portray themselves to the general population as protectors and promoters of Orthodox Sunni Islam. Finally, madrasas also played an important role in training the scholars and elites who operated the state bureaucracy. Madrasas also played a supporting role to major learning institutions like the Cairo-Yin Mosque, in part because, unlike the mosque, they provided accommodations for students who came from outside the city. Many of these students were poor, seeking sufficient education to gain a higher position in their hometowns, and the madrasas provided them with basic necessities such as lodging and bread. However, the madrasas were also teaching institutions in their own right and offered their own courses, with some Islamic scholars making their reputation by teaching at certain madrasas. Madrasas were generally centered around a main courtyard with a central fountain, off which other rooms could be accessed. Student living quarters were typically distributed on an upper floor around the courtyard. Many madrasas also included a prayer hall with a mihrab, though only the Bo-Inania madrasa of Fez officially functioned as a full mosque and featured its own minaret. In the Marinid era, madrasas also evolved to be lavishly decorated. Most Muslim graves are traditionally simple and unadorned, but in North Africa the graves of important figures were often covered in a domed structure, or a cupola of often pyramidal shape, called a quba, also spelled kuba. This was especially characteristic for the tombs of saints such as Walis and Marabouts, individuals who came to be venerated for their strong piety, reputed miracles, or other mystical attributes. Many of these existed within the wider category of Islamic mysticism known as Sufism. Some of these tombs became the focus of entire religious complexes built around them, known as a zawiyah, They typically included a mosque, school, and other charitable facilities. Such religious establishments were major centers of Moroccan Sufism and grew in power and influence over the centuries, often associated with specific Sufi brotherhoods or schools of thought. The Saadian dynasty, for example, began as a military force associated with the Zawiya and followers of Muhammad al-Ghazali, a major 15th century Sufi scholar. The Alaouites after them also sponsored many zawiyas across the country. Some of the most important examples of zawiyas in Morocco include the Zawiya of Moulay Idris I near Meknes, the Zawiya of his son Moulay Idris II in Fez, and the tombs of the Seven Saints in Marrakech. Hammams are public bathhouses which were ubiquitous in Muslim cities. Many historic hammams have been preserved in cities like Marrakech and especially Fez, partly thanks to their continued use by locals up to the present day. Among the better-known examples of preserved historic hammams in Morocco is the 14th century Saffron Hammam in Fez, which has recently undergone restoration and rehabilitation. Essentially derived from the Roman bathhouse model, hammams normally consisted of 4 main chambers, a changing room, from which one then moved on to a cold room, a warm room, and a hot room. Heat and steam were generated by a hypercaust system which heated the floors. The furnace reused natural organic materials, such as wood shavings, olive pits, or other organic waste byproducts, by burning them for fuel. The smoke generated by this furnace helped with heating the floors while excess smoke was evacuated through chimneys. Of the different rooms, only the changing room was heavily decorated with zellige, stucco, or carved wood. The cold, warm, and hot rooms were usually vaulted or domed chambers without windows, designed to keep steam from escaping, but partially lit thanks to small holes in the ceiling which could be covered by ceramic or colored glass. As in many Muslim cities, water was provided freely to the public through a number of street fountains, similar to sebels in the former Ottoman Empire. Some fountains were decorated with a canopy of sculpted wood or zellige tilework. Fountains were often attached to the outside of mosques, funduks, and aristocratic mansions. According to Leo Africanus, a traveler and chronicler in the 16th century, there were some 600 fountains in Fez alone. Well-known examples in Morocco include the Nejdourine fountain in Fez, the Shrab ou Chouf fountain in Marrakech, and the Moussin fountain attached to the mosque of the same name. Moroccan cities and towns were supplied with water through a number of different mechanisms. As elsewhere, most settlements were built near existing water sources such as rivers and oases. However, further engineering was necessary in order to supplement natural sources and in order to distribute the water across the city directly. Domestic architecture, riads. A riad is an interior garden found in many Moroccan mansions and palaces. It is normally rectangular and divided into 4 parts along its central axis, with a fountain at its middle. Riad gardens probably originated in Persian architecture, where it is also known as Kahaba, and became a prominent feature in Moorish palaces in Spain, such Medinat al-Zahra, the Aliafiria and the Alhambra. In Morocco, they became especially widespread in the palaces and mansions of Marrakech, where the combination of available space and warm climate made them particularly appealing. The term is nowadays applied in a broader way to traditional Moroccan houses that have been converted into hotels and tourist guest houses. Traditional Moroccan houses were typically centered around a courtyard or patio, often surrounded by a gallery, from which other rooms and sections branched off. Courtyard houses have historical antecedents in the houses and villas of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean world and even earlier in the ancient Middle East. These houses were inward-focused. Even rich mansions are usually completely unadorned on the outside, with all decoration concentrated on the inside. There were few, if any, large windows on the outside. The entrance, which led to the courtyard, was typically a bent entrance that prevented outsiders in the street from seeing directly inside the house. As with other traditional Moroccan structures, decoration included carved stucco, sculpted and painted wood, and zelige tilework. The central patio/courtyard, known as the wastada, middle of the house, was thus the centerpiece of the house. The size and craftsmanship of this interior space was an indication of the status and wealth of its owners, rather than the house's external appearance. Today, modern materials have increasingly replaced certain traditional ones during the renovations of old houses. Wooden mashrabiyah-type windows have been replaced with iron grilles, and cement is used for walls and pillars instead of brick and round earth. Palaces, sultans and caliphs, as well as the more powerful and wealthy government ministers in the 19th and 20th century, were able to build extensive palaces. The Dar al-Muqsin, meaning roughly house/abode of the government, referred to the royal palace and center of government in a number of cities, such as the Dar al-Muqsin in Fez, Rabat, Tangier, Meknes, or Marrakech. These palaces are still generally off-limit to most visitors today. However, royal palaces generally had a Mecca or a large walled square which acted as a ceremonial space or parade ground at the entrance of the palace. These squares were accessible to the public and formed the public facade of the ruler's abode, sometimes overlooked by monumental and well-decorated gates leading to the palace grounds, for example Bab Mansour in Meknes. The Mekouars of Fez El Jadid are examples of these, as was the vast square known today as Place El Hidim in Meknes. The palaces themselves typically consisted of many structures and pavilions arranged around a series of courtyards, pleasure gardens, and riots. This resulted in palace complexes with a sprawling layout. In some cases, this was a consequence of multiple phases of construction taking place in different periods. These palaces often also included a number of normally public facilities such as bathhouses and mosques, thus practically making them self-sufficient and self-contained royal cities. Sultans also built additional outlying palaces and pavilions such as the Dar Batar in Fez, as well as vast gardens on the outskirts of their capital city such as the Agdol Gardens in Marrakech and the former Mazara Garden in Fez.